Persia was a global superpower for centuries. At their peak, they had an empire from Greece to China, but by the 7th century, Persia itself was finally conquered by an imperial power. The victors were fired by their new faith, and this would change the history of Persia and with it, the world. Today we will learn about the Arab conquest of Persia. This is Knowledge Voyage. Today, Iran, once known as Persia, is an Islamic republic. It is also a notorious exporter of revolutionary Shia Islam, and 99% of the population follows the Muslim faith. But it wasn't always this way. In fact, Persia was once home to the Zoroastrian faith, the faith of ancient pre-Islamic Persia. Pre-Islamic Persia was an impressive power, but by the 7th century, things were changing. Persia had fought a series of grinding, expensive, and highly destructive wars with Rome. These wars had seen Roman Byzantine troops looting and burning imperial cities, and much of the once wealthy and thriving lands of Persian-ruled Iraq were devastated. As if that wasn't enough, a second catastrophe hit when the Justinian plague hit Persia. This plague further weakened the country by killing off disproportionate numbers of young men who were needed to man the border forts. As Persia reeled under the impact of the wars with Rome and the plague, there was a third hammer blow to hit them, and that was the Arabs. The Arabs had recently converted to Islam and were exploding outwards against their neighbours. The Persians were an obvious target. That said, the initial Arab attack on Persia was a failure, and despite being weakened, the Persian army managed to beat back the Arab attackers at the Battle of the Bridge in 634 AD. But the Persian commander decided not to pursue the fleeing Arabs, and this would come back to haunt him. Arab Muslims were led by a caliph, and at the time of the invasion of Persia, this caliph was Caliph Umar, who had been a personal companion of the Prophet Muhammad. Caliph Umar demanded vengeance for the Arab defeat, but he had a problem. Following Muhammad's death 2 years previously, there had been infighting amongst Arabs in the so-called Ridda Wars, and while Sunni Muslim rule had been quickly re-established, the caliph didn't trust the tribes who had joined the rebellion. Instead, he chose Arab clans from Yemen, who would remain loyal to the caliph during the Ridda Wars. It would be these Yemeni loyalists who would spearhead the invasion of Persia. At the Battle of Qadisiyah, these Yemeni troops defeated the Persians by crossing the river on horseback in parts of the river the Persians didn't realise was shallow. The Persians were defeated, and local Iraqis had no choice but to make their peace with the victorious Arabs, and with Iraq open, the borders of Persia itself were open to attack. The Persian Empire was to prove a victim of its own success. Its centralised empire meant it could support a large modern army, but if and when this large modern army was beaten, there was no local source of power to continue the fight, and the Arabs knew it. In battle after battle, the Arabs relied on mobile tactics to defeat the Persians. At one clash, forces commanded by Persian General Firuzan fled and were killed as they fell down steep ravines in retreat. As Arab Muslim troops moved in, local cities often offered their surrender. Many believed this was a smart short-term move, and the Persians would return relatively soon to liberate them, as had happened during the wars with Rome. But this time, it would be different. There would be no liberation. The key to the conquest of Persia was at Rai, giving the Arabs control over the neck of 2 rivers and controlling the roads bypassing the salty deserts. Whilst the Persians generally gave up and made peace in most places, in the province of Fars there was an exception. Fars was the cultural heart of ethnic Persia and the main centre of Zoroastrianism. At the city of Bishapur, where an unusually large Zoroastrian fire temple stood, Arabs slaughtered many Persians who refused to give in, even when the city's strategic situation looked hopeless. And at the city of Istakir, Arabs needed to use catapults and other siege engines to break into the city, before mass desecrations of fire temples, massacres and enslavements of the populations followed. The victorious Arab commander now hunted the Shah of Iran, and the Shah's name was Yazgard III. At the city of Merv, the Shah's nobles offered him the chance to flee. He calmly and nobly stated that he would not flee and abandon his people, explaining, quote, "The world's king must not abandon them to their suffering." But despite his desire to fight on, Yazgard was a new king, with no track record of loyalty amongst his nobles. These nobles didn't stand by their Shah, instead cutting deals with the Arabs in exchange for some continued privilege. Sadly, Yazgard would die by assassination whilst hiding in a mill owner's home, and with him died the Sassanid Empire. In the centuries that would follow, the Zoroastrian faith would almost completely collapse, and Persian culture was heavily Islamized. But the Persians didn't adopt the Arabic language, as had the conquered peoples of Egypt or Syria. Instead, they retained their Persian tongue, sometimes known as Farsi, which is renowned for its beauty. The Arab conquest of Persia was a key event in world history, and from here, the doors to India and further Muslim conquests were wide open. Thanks for watching everyone, don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Thank you.